Okay, so it's recording. All right, so for okay, so where did we stop? On project definition. Okay, so I hope everyone has gone through the previous video, basically on project definition. So just to recap, okay, so project definition is the first stage of project management. Okay, so it defines the project at the initial stage. So this is not project contract or whatsoever. We haven't reached the contract part yet. So this is basically happening at the client's organization. Okay, so the developer might have a certain pool of funding. Okay, and what to do about that? Okay, so what kind of project is intended that to be carried out to ensure that it is aligned also with the strategic plan of an organization. Okay, so for private, it will be a lot of profit oriented. Okay, so meaning to say that how actually this project could increase the profit or the economic well-being of the organization. Okay, so project definition. So it's a very simple topic basically. And at the end of this project definition, you should be able to draft a simple project charter. So the document that will be the output of this process basically would be what we call project charter. So project definition is something like sometimes project charter might be called it might not be called project charter in an organization. Okay, so it's just a formal term for something that is in a sense that looks like a working paper. Okay, so kertas kerja, but it needs to be endorsed by the stakeholder, and you have a person that is going to be in charge of that. Okay, so that is a project charter. So in this situation, the project manager would be the person who is given the authority to conduct further processes from here. And the project manager that we are talking about will be project manager that is on the client's organization, that is in the client's organization. Okay, so it is not project manager that is involved with contractor. Okay, so it's a project manager on the client side. Okay, so these are several elements that could be included in a project definition. Okay, so and finally the output will be project charter, except that not all project charter will look the same. Okay, so there are some project charter which might go more detailed. Okay, so would be more comprehensive, probably with a larger capital. But there are also project charters which are a little bit simpler, depending on the capital, depending on what the client wants, how comprehensive the project charter would be. Okay, but among the elements that potentially you should have in a project charter would be as such. Okay, so you should have what the project is about. Okay, so what is the intended objective and aim of the project. Okay, so and of course when we are coming up with the project, we need to know what are the benefits the client would expect from the project. Okay, so and then what are the factors that could influence the project? So it can be anything coming from the external, such as the local authority rules, local authority planning, strategic planning. It must be aligned with their planning. And also it can be external factors such as land conversion and so on. So it can be anything that could influence the project before the project could be deemed feasible, okay, so to be executed. And then the deliverables will be what are the output. Okay, so what are the output from a project, what is expected, what the client would expect from a project. Success factor, basically how will we know a project is successful? For us, construction is pretty straightforward, whatever will be given later in the contract. Okay, but at this stage, at the very initial stage, at least we would have like a certain sense of what are the factors that the client would say that okay, project to consider okay, okay, so it's successful. So it could be for example the installation of green facilities, or it could be zero accident. So whatever that the client deem a project is successful, besides the time, cost, quality too. Okay, what resources are available? This one depending on the project. If it's a simple residential project, I don't think the resources could be a huge problem. But what we are talking about, if the project is requiring certain specialized areas, okay, so any geotechnical perspective that is required, do we have the right expert in giving us the advice and so on? Okay, so if it's a typical project, tak ada issue, unless we're talking about project that might be highly dependent on ICT, for example, okay, and so on. Okay, and then we have gone through underlying principles are basically the guiding principles of an organization. So organizations, they might have their own principle. Particularly if you're talking about organization who are very local based, okay, so they might want employees to be all local, okay, or there are organizations who are emphasizing on BIM, for example. So their principle is whereby if you're bidding for their project, then basically you are required to use BIM, maybe. So depending on an organization, so usually every organization is quite distinct between them in terms of the principle. Okay, so those are the elements that you might question your client, or you might try to get the answer for the elements. And how the next part is basically implementing or implanting basically the output from all the elements into a document called project charter. Okay, so your project charter might start or might have this one at the front part of the document. Okay, so it might have this signature authorized by the stakeholders, and then the name of the project manager, okay, and then key stakeholder, okay, so project goals. Where did we stop in the last class?
Project constraints and boundaries.
Project constraint boundaries, yeah. Okay, so the next elements are basically project priority. So this one will relate back to your second chapter, which is the project priority matrix. Okay, so what are the emphasis of the client? So you might already ask the client at this stage itself, what is their priority? Okay, and then the scope statement, product requirement, project assumptions, okay, and this one will be the other parts that we'll go through today. Okay, so far that we have gone through, any question do you that you have from the previous lecture? So if no, I assume it's clear.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so for today, basically we'll move on to the next one. So it's basically left with a little bit from this chapter basically. Okay, so project constraint and project boundaries. Okay, so if we look through here, project constraint is basically any constraint, any boundaries placed on this project. Okay, so it can be any funding limits, any time limits, any regulation, any quality standards, and so on. Okay, so project constraint is whatever factor that actually could constrain the feasibility of this project. Okay, so if there are certain limited funding, and that will be so this should be stated really well. Okay, any time constraint by the client. So actually it relates back also to the project priority matrix. So before you can actually define the project priority matrix, what are the factors that we are looking at? Okay, so besides the time, beside the cost, we have also regulation constraint. If the local authority is not happy with a project such as what they call the development of factories around their area, so that might not be good lah. Okay, so any regulation constraint, and also any quality standard that must be met. Okay, so that is project constraint and boundaries. So if as a project manager, when you are deriving this document, project charter, you need to identify the potential constraint. If you could not identify the constraint related, And then once the process is ongoing and you identify that during that time, you have wasted that much of time at the front end. Okay, so project charter, it might look simple, but at least it should give you a clarity, a clear picture of how your project would be affected. Okay, so if you, let's say you are just looking at the points of budget, the points of time, the points of quality, but you overlook the regulation, you did not realize the environment is um, highly sensitive, okay, so very green area. So those are the things that you might want to really take into consideration, because it might affect your costs. Okay, so there are certain areas that you might actually, think carefully about, such as brownfield areas. Okay, how much cost will it implicate on the client? So those are the things that you need to really highlight to ensure that the client is aware of all this constraint. And once they're aware, they realize it and they're okay with it and they sign on this document, then it is what it is. Okay, so it could be proceeded with that knowledge that they have known basically on the project. Okay, so it's the job of the project manager to ensure all these are carefully thought through and indicated in the document. So if you have withheld this kind of like factors, and moving forward, this is the thing that is going to give constraint to your project, it's a deep problem juga lah. Okay, so it might not be feasible and the project needs to be called off and so on, so leceh. Okay, all right, so the next element that you can input will be initial project risk. Okay, so any obstacles, any risks that might prevent the successful attainment of project goals must be considered. Okay, so it can be any or basically the use of risk management. Okay, so risk response, risk sharing, risk avoidance basically could be part of it lah. Okay, so if you could see actually the elements are linked to each other. For example, if you have identified all this, okay, so if you have identified the constraint might be budget, the further portion of your project charter could actually mention, if we do not get the budget, what will be the project risk? So will the project be called off? Or if given that is the risk, so are there other ways into going eliminating or reducing the intensity of the risk? Okay, so once you identify potential effect, your risk comes into picture. Okay, so because these are elements that actually give you risk to the project execution. So but what if we already have this, so what? Okay, so what will happen if there are certain regulation as such? Okay, so the land could not be so probably is an agricultural land into manufacturing. So what is the risk if we cannot change the land title? So what would happen? So those are the things that you need to think of. Okay, and then the next list of deliverables. Okay, so the project charter should include a list of deliverables produced by the project, submitted to a customer, production manager. Okay, so list of deliverables basically will be the list of outcome. Okay, the output. So this could be intermediate or end deliverables. Okay, so intermediate is between you have the output, you need to pass on to the next subcontractor, for example. Okay, so that could be intermediate. The end will be the final one given back to the client. Okay, and also what potentially could be the cost estimation for this project. Okay, so this is basically how you come up with a simplified cost estimation. So it will not be based on drawing, it will not be based on a very detailed QS estimation or whatsoever, because you do not have any drawings produced at this point of time. So it is just very draft cost estimation. At least you have a big figure rather than in a decimal point or whatsoever. Okay, so cost estimation. Schedule estimation is also same. Okay, so you will have major milestones. Okay, so you would have starting from identifying the project definition, feasibility study, market survey, a very major milestone, and then project planning, so until the end. So what are the estimated schedule? So you might not be able to get a very detailed estimation, but at least a mere estimation, okay? Not by day, okay? So you might get by month, for example, rather than by day, okay? So estimation. And integrated change control. Okay, so hold on. So integrated change control. Okay, so the project charter must also define how changes will be managed. So if there are any changes initiated by the client, okay, so how would it um, be managed? Okay, so integrated change control. And who has the authority to accept those changes or reject those changes? Okay, and success criteria is basically what is considered successful by the client. So you can see that whatever we input in the project charter reflects the elements that we have questioned them, okay, initially in the first part of the lecture. So what does the client imply as being successful for a project? Okay, so sometimes not everything is about time, but for construction it is. Okay, probably for other project might not, but for construction we are talking about the time. It doesn't run from that, the time, the cost, the scope. Okay, but other than that, they might also imply on safety and also environment. Okay, so success criteria, or there are other indicators of success criteria, including maybe the organization is moving towards this compliance to the SDG. Okay, so sustainable development goal. Okay, so maybe an organization that actually looks into what SDG do they address, and could this project address those SDGs? Okay, so I think at this point of time, you should, or in your current study, you should know or you should understand what is SDG. Okay, so sustainable development goals. Okay, so you should know that we have a few. So for example, like gender equality, no poverty, economy, related to environment, life on water, and so on. Okay, so you at least need to know that is one of the items that I think all organizations, not only construction. So you're talking about banking, finance, all basically organization are trying to direct their strategy, okay, direct their action plan towards addressing those SDGs. Okay, so that is one of the things which actually is a selling point for organizations nowadays, basically. Okay. All right, so next one, what to do if you do not have project charter? So usually we would have one. If it's not called project charter, it might be called working paper or whatsoever. Okay, so if you as a project manager, you have no written project charter, you should write one, submit to the sponsor, the client, and the other key stakeholders for review, revision, and written approval. Okay, so it is critical that those charters are written and signed by these stakeholders. So it gives authority to the project manager to move forward with the project. Okay, so a project without a certain conclusive document is quite difficult for people, or basically in this case project manager, to execute their work. Okay, so because it's like macam tak ada, you are being appointed as an engineer but without the letter, so you don't have the authority to act as a project engineer or to make any decision in regards to your authority. Okay, so that is basically about project charter. You need someone to be given the authority by someone higher, okay, usually the funder, to ensure that the project could be executed and there are bases to it. Okay. All right, so this one is basically in a perspective, okay, in a simplified manner, what we do to define a project. Okay, so project definition document. Okay, so these are generally the items required for project definition document. Okay, we have mentioned about the purpose. Okay, so the aim of the project, the goal, objective, the success criteria. Okay, so what are considered successful, project context, project dependencies, scope, source constraint, assumptions, and so on. Okay, and other additional elements, if you want to actually input it in your charter, basically any other alternative approaches. So because when we are at the stage of project definition, you might want to see, rather than doing using approach A, you might go for approach B. Okay, so in simple manner, for example, rather than going with let's say the concept is cast in situ, you might go for precast, 100% precast, for example, rather than cast in situ. So there are alternatives in doing work. Okay, so especially for construction nowadays. So, but with that alternative, you need to also check with the time, the cost, the constraints, and so on. Okay, and then organization change issue. Okay, so any changes in the organization, any changes in the project, any policies that you want to mention in the project charter. Okay, so prelim course. So you can see that it actually kind of overlaps to each other actually. So we did mention this in the project charter and references to support document. Okay, so in this chapter, basically what you need to do, what you need to know is basically the basic elements that you need to input in a project charter. Okay, you don't need to memorize. Okay, so but at least you need to know. If you memorize, okay, so if you memorize, somehow or rather, if you forget about it, so in the exam tu you akan lupa terus. Okay, so rather than memorizing, try to think from a project manager's shoe. What do you need to know in a project before your project can be executed? Okay, so you need to, usually when in terms of project management subject, it is really to do with put yourself in that perspective. Okay, so think from that angle. What do you as a project manager that acts on behalf of client want to know? Okay, what you need to highlight to the client so that the processes after this will be in a flow. Okay, so that. Okay, so basically why is it important? Okay, so the importance obviously is basically very logical. If you do not have this authorizing document, you do not have the authority to conduct a project. Okay, so hence basically at least once you have this project charter, you have basic factors covered. Okay, so rather than mindlessly, blindly carrying out all the other feasibility study activities. Okay, so rather than blindly going through with your market survey, if you do not have a if you realize there are certain constraints that you could not actually eliminate, but then prior to that you have done your market survey, it will be such a waste of time. Okay, so might as well you make a good the project charter, ensure that all factors has been taken into account. Once it's okay, then you move on to the market survey just to ensure that you have the demand for your project too. Okay, so if not, if you conduct a market survey prior to this, you get the market survey response is okay, but you have these factors which you could not eliminate. Okay, so dia leceh lah. Okay, so once you have a proper documentation taken into account all of these factors, you should have a proper good kickstart to your project. Okay, to ensure the alignment with organizational goal. Okay, so to ensure management support, manage stakeholder expectation, and control project scope. Okay, so actually you can see that once you have a project charter, it could actually give you all this, it could address all these issues. Okay, so and reasons to separate definition from detailed planning. Detailed planning is different than project definition. Moving on after this, we'll talk about planning. But it is different because project planning is done at the very initial stage just to set the stage for the project. Okay, so you do not go into detailed planning without going through definition. It will be a waste of time that once you have gone through detailed planning and you realize that one simple factor gives away your project. Okay, so this is where you actually look into the feasibility in a general perspective before you go for a detailed planning. Okay, and how you come up with all this basically is there are questions to it. Okay, so you can either ask in a question form in such a way, or you can actually identify right away the aspects that you're going to touch on in terms of project definition. Okay, all right, so and we are done on project definition chapter. Okay, so the next chapter will be on project planning. So far, any question? We have 3 minutes before we stop. Okay, so for those who came in late to the class, today there will be a little bit of disruption ticket to our class because I have to be the secretariat for a PhD Viva. So the Viva is basically starting at 9, and probably it will end around probably 11. But to set up that 9, I need to have at least 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after it started. Okay, so just to make sure that that every participant in the Viva is in the room. So we will stop our class at 8:45 and we will continue back at 9:15. Okay, so meanwhile, any question for what we have now? So once we continue with 9:15 too, we'll go on to the chapter of construction planning. Any question?
Doktor nak tanya.
Yes.
Projek charter ni sama dengan tender document ke?
Bukan. Tender document, it will be much further. Project charter is basically from, okay, you imagine when you want to start a project, you as the working in the client's department, so you baru nak have proposal. It's like a proposal and your proposal being endorsed by the stakeholder. So project charter is at that stage. So how it will go through, okay, once your project charter has been agreed upon, you will conduct feasibility study, you will conduct detailed site investigation, you will conduct market survey. Okay, so in terms of feasibility, once you have conducted market survey, you think it's okay, site investigation is okay, then the client would hire a consultant. Okay, so the client would hire architect to come up with the drawing, CNS, MNE to come up with the drawing based on what you have actually identified initially. Okay, so once coming up with the drawing, QS will come up with the tender document based on the drawing, baru buka tender. So you can see it's actually very far from the tender. So it is at the very initial stage where the client baru nak buat proposal ni. So just thinking of, okay, what are the factors that might affect project? Because when you come up with a proposal, sometimes there are projects yang you do not think through. You just, okay, mindlessly, okay, I want to conduct your project there. I don't care how, I just want to conduct. That creates problem because you don't think overall what factor could actually give problem to your project, to environment and so on. So a proper way of doing a project management, you do your desk study, you conduct prior investigation before you embark on planning, design, and then tender construction. Okay, so it's a very initial stage, so it's not the same. Okay, Akmal.
Okay, doktor. Faham.
All right, any other question? Okay, if tak ada, we stop now. And I think I'll just leave the room as it is so that you guys tak perlu keluar. So and then we'll start back at 9:15. Okay? All right. Thank you. Okay, is everyone in the room? Semua ada ke ni?
Ada.
Let's see, 44. Okay, I think we can continue. Okay, so since I've mentioned 9:15, is this 9:12? I think should be fine. All right, so let's continue to the next topic, which is on project planning. Okay, all right, everyone can see the slide.
Yes.
All right, so the next topic is basically a topic which is quite long. Okay, so it's the heart of project management. So you have project definition at a very initial stage. Okay, and then after that will be a lot to do with planning. So planning is done by all parties in that are having interest in a project. Okay, so at the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand there are several stages in planning. Okay, what needs to be planned in construction and the steps in scheduling. Okay, so this will basically lead you to construction critical path method and so on. Okay, so basically what is called planning. Okay, so it's an ongoing process of defining organization's objective and goal, and it is basically an overall strategy to achieve this goal. Okay, and for government project, basically public works department, usually during tender they would require contractors to submit their work progress according to contract sum. If it's high capital project, they might require the use of Primavera. Okay, so it's a software that actually specifically to do with projects. Okay, so scheduling projects. And also if you're talking about a lower sum, might be Microsoft project, which is sufficient enough. Okay, so and when we're talking about planning, basically no one plans to fail, obviously. So no one of us that actually thinks about failing, but sometimes people fail to plan. Okay, so sometimes we are too eager, too excited to actually start a project without properly thinking through the planning part. Because basically when we talk about planning, planning is basically non-tangible. Okay, so you do a lot of planning, and some people think that planning is non-tangible. You cannot feel there is an output to it. Okay, so that's why sometimes people take for granted when talking about planning. So but if you don't do the right plan, if you don't look into every angle of your action, then you might not see what are the consequences of your action though. Okay, so you will not see the different angles that your project might be affected. Okay, so that's why it's very important for project that you have a strong initial foundation on particularly planning part too. Okay, because sometimes kita too eager, we go in the project, we just want to conduct things fast. Okay, so without properly sitting down and thinking about the potential things that might go in a different way. Okay, so when we are talking about planning, okay, so planning process will answer this basic question. Okay, what must be done? So what must be done too is about what? So these are the questions that not only in project, so basically in whatever you do, these are the questions that you might want to ask yourself. Okay, so for a project, for an assignment, for example, what must be done? What must be done too will be answering what? Process. Okay, what are the activities to be done? What are the things to be done? So for your assignment, for example, it's given a certain topic, there is a timeline, there is requirement to it, but what do you need to do to ensure that you answer to the assignment? Something like that. Okay, similar to a certain project. What are the activities being required? What are the processes required to actually finally address that project. Okay, so what must be done? So what must be done basically in terms of activities, processes. Okay, how it should be done? What would it answer in statement form?
Method.
Method. Okay, pandai. All right. So how it should be done will be the thought of method. How are you going to tackle that issue? Okay. What are the different approaches you might have? So this is where you might have several approaches, several alternative. Okay. So you might want to choose the one that benefit you the most. So depending on the strength that you have in an organization. Okay. So if you are talking about for example, concreting. Okay, so depending on the size of your site, do you actually rely on all these batching truck? Okay, so all these concrete truck to go in and out of your site basically for concrete what do you call concrete supply, or do you require or come up with a batching plan by itself? Okay, so those are the alternative that you can think of depending on the size of your project. So which would be the most economical? Okay, so who should do it? What would you answer? Who should do it?
Expertise.
Expertise, or you can actually right away mention about human resource. Okay, so human resource requirement. Okay, so who should do it? So what kind of subcontractor do you require? What kind of expert do you require? What kind of professional do you require? So if it's a typical project, you might look into just what who are the what do you call subcontractors requiring for concreting work, for reinforcement bar work and so on. Okay, so rebar work and so on. Who should do it? When it should be done? I think this is quite clear lah, yeah. Okay, so the time. Okay, so what are the time constraint that is given to you, and how much will it cost? Will be straightforward also, the cost factor. Okay, so these are the constraint, or these are the basic question that you might want to ask yourself before you can actually go full swing with your planning. Okay. All right. So in construction, generally, who plans? Okay, all parties plan. So you would have client planning for the job, you will have designer planning for the job, you will have contractor planning for the job. Except that when you're talking about these different parties, the extent of the planning it differs compared to each other. Okay, the content, or basically the details of the planning differ slightly from each other. Okay, so if you put yourself in the shoe of the client, okay, obviously as a client you are interested in the overall project. Okay, so starting from the very beginning, acquisition of land until the use of facility. So the time expand, okay, so the span of time will be the longest to plan. Okay, so as a client, you will plan starting from the very beginning, which means starting from project definition lah. Okay, so if you want to put project definition as one of the milestone at the initial stage, then you might put starting from project definition. But as a consultant or as a contractor, you do not need to look from here. So as a CNS, you do not need to look from here. Okay, so and you do not also look into until the use of facility. So the client will have the longest span in terms of planning. Okay, so interested on the overall project, and the client determines the time of cash outflow for which provision had to be made. Okay, so this is very important when the client requires to pay off for the progress payment. Okay, so monthly progress payment. So when it would be required for the payment to be done. So that is very important, because let's say given a certain time frame, it should be allocated and the money should be there to actually provide the progress payment to the contractor. So sometimes this will be an issue where the client is not able to actually come up with the or could not adhere to the timeline of payment too. So that causes project to be delayed, and contractor would not want to work on the site and so on. Okay, so this is very important to determine when the cash outflow and when the funding or cash inflow will come in. So that is important. And of course, as a client, you will also decide on the type of contract. Okay, so what are the common types of contract do we use in construction? Just name a few. What type of common type of contract do we have in construction?
Turnkey.
Turnkey, okay. Other than that? Turnkey meaning to say that it will be handed over to the turnkey contractor, and basically the client at the end of the day just turn the key je. Okay, so everything will be handled by the turnkey contractor. Other than that?
Traditional.
Again what?
Traditional.
Traditional, okay. What else?
Lump sum.
Lump sum, okay. So if you see that, basically there are lump sum, there are turnkey, there are traditional. Okay, there are slightly different if you're talking about lump sum and also you're talking about traditional. Okay, traditional is a method of contractual arrangement. Okay, so for example, okay, or procurement. So when we mention something about contractor arrangement such as traditional, design and build, it gives us the whole picture how your contract arrangement within that would be. Okay, so for example, traditional, or we call it design with build. Okay, so when we're talking about traditional, it is the how the contractual arrangement would be, who will be in contract with who. Okay, so in a traditional method, basically the client would actually have contract, would hire in the consultant. Okay, and the consultant, once all designs are complete, will pass on to the QS, and QS come up with the tender document. Okay, so once they have the tender document open for bidding, then you have contractor coming in. Okay, so contractor coming in to bid for the project and contract awarded to the winning contractor. So that is the contract arrangement for traditional. And then you have design build, which is quite common also. Okay, so design build is whereby a client hire design build contractor. So meaning to say that the design build contractor can be one entity that, or one organization that contains design and also can do contracting, or it could be a joint venture between two organizations, two companies, but they do the whole package too. They do the design and they do the building together. So design build project, you can do, or you can actually conduct fast track project, because you are working together. You can design foundation, contractor buat foundation, and then at the same time the designer is doing the second floor column, beam design and so on. Okay, so design build could allow you to conduct a fast track. So that is basically contractual arrangement. Okay, so whereby or else sometimes we call it procurement system. Okay, so from the contract arrangement to how you going to pay the subcon, for example. So maybe there are main cons and you want to pay the subcon, or maybe the client, how the client is going to pay the main contractor is based on the contract too. That is what we call type of contract, or contract such as maybe you want to pay them through lump sum. Okay, so meaning to say that your payment, okay, so your payment will be based on lump sum. Okay, so for example, if I'm a client and I'm telling the main contractor, okay, I hire you. Okay, so maybe it's through negotiation. It is not design build or design build, and I will pay you lump sum this much of excavation of this land. Then you can clear off the land. Okay, you'll be given lump sum to clearing up such a land. Okay, so one payment, or it could be based on BQ, for example, bill of quantities. Okay, so contract is how you intend to pay the pay your subcon and whatsoever. Okay, so it's basically is different. Okay, so the procurement system or the contractual arrangement is as such who is in contract with who, but how are you paying or how are you signing off the contract, it is based on how you are going to pay the contractor. Okay, so lump sum ke, bill of quantity ke, or something like that. Okay, so just to distinguish the two things. Okay, so sometimes we use it interchangeably. So, but basically those are two different way of talking about it. Okay, and then the procurement of M&E plant. Okay, so if you have heavily loaded M&E plants that is being required, particularly when we talk about projects such as hospital. Okay, so those are heavily relying on the M&E, for example. So those would require huge expertise by and also the inclusion of doctors and also nurses at the initial phase. Okay, and other major decisions which may affect the overall project duration. Okay, so basically as a client, they should have got pretty good view of the project at the project definition phase. Okay, so and then going through feasibility and so on. Okay, so far any question on planning by the client?
Not yet.
Okay, all right. So the next stakeholder or the next party who would actually plan will be the designers. So designer, straightforward. So their planning basically it could be planning for their own resources or it could be planning for the project by itself. Okay, so they carry responsibility to prepare the plans used by the client in taking strategic decisions. Okay, so um of course, as a designer, you have your own organization to run. So you need to plan one for your own self, which is for your own resources to determine what sectors of work will be given to which designer. Okay, so the number of designers to be allocated for a certain project. And also another one for the project, usually the designer would look into this kind of aspects. Okay, so activities to be planned, you might include investigation of the site. Okay, so especially soil investigation, site investigation, okay, design calculation, the drawings. You need to also look into the statutory planning and the approvals by the council, prepare the specification. So this will be done by the QS, tender program, QS in combination with the consultant, and preparation of quality system. So you can imagine that as a designer, okay, so usually the client will hire designer, usually if it's a normal project, if it's not civil project, then the contractor will be the first designer that the client would approach. Okay, so sorry, the architect. Okay, so the architect will be the first designer that the client approach, and the architect will come up with the concept. Okay, so the concept drawing, and if it is okay, basically it would actually move on with the detailed drawing of the architect. It will be joined by the CNS, it will be joined by the M&E. Okay, but prior to coming up with all of that, investigation needs to be done. Okay, one, it will start off with desk investigation. Okay, so the architect will need to look into what are the environment involved and whether the concept suits the environment within it. Okay, and then once it's okay, soil investigation for CNS. Okay, so and so on. Right, so there are various investigation and the input will be given to the respective consultant. So once the investigation is done and it could provide a certain alternative to the designers or what are the different foundation, for example, to be used based on the soil investigation, then they can move on with the design calculation, the drawing. Okay, and of course all of these usually all this document, once it is ready, it will be passed on to the authority for approval. So in this case, normally nowadays we have one-stop center, and hence it will be passed on to the council. Okay, so hold on. Okay, so once it is fine, okay, so it will be passed on to the local council, and they will basically look into the drawing, and if it's okay, then it will be approved. Obviously preparation of specification to after that. Okay, so once it attained the approval from the council and everything is fine as it is, okay, so there will be preparation of specification, open for tender, and finally if there are any preparation for quality system. Okay, and the next stakeholder obviously will be the contractor. So the most complicated planning will be done by the contractor. Okay, so the contractor basically would need to think how the 2D drawing, and nowadays we have in 3D basically, if you're coming up with a BIM model, so 3D drawing would be translated into physical build on site. Okay, so the contractor basically is divided between planning at the estimation stage and production planning. Okay, so planning at the estimation stage is basically contractors who tender for the project. So once the designer has come up with specification, tender document, you have contractors coming in. Okay, so there will be many contractors who want to tender for the project. So that will be tendering contractor. So that will be planning at the estimation stage. You need this so that the cost estimation with the relevant duration is realistic enough for the project to be conducted. Okay, and another one is basically at the production planning stage. Okay, so once the contractor has won the tender, then they would need to come up with production planning. So the most complicated planning will be the production planning stage. Okay, so because you are trying to build in physical, taking into account the input from the architect, the M&E, and also the CNS. So how those elements comes together, which one comes first, which one comes second. So those things, to come up with a schedule as such, it is not easy. Okay, so rather than visualization, you will need also experience. Okay, so you will need the experience that you have gone through. Okay, so in construction, M&E comes along together with the contractor. Okay, so M&E comes along with the CNS. Okay, so for example, you have embedded electrical conduit, for example, or piping system which is embedded. So those are the things that you need to think that, okay, so it's not that CNS finish everything, baru M&E come. Can, unless your M&E is not embedded within the ground. But I highly doubt so. It comes along together basically. Okay, so in estimating, basically planning involve preparation of work program and also proposal. And for production, basically involve planning allocation of resources. Okay, and your plan must be able to cater changes. So if there are any variations, if there are any mistakes, whether, so this is what we call buffer time. So we have like a time which in case something happen, but your buffer time tak adalah sampai lama sangat. Okay, so in case something happen, you still can fall back on your original time frame. So which means it will be a more what do we call it? A more optimistic time frame basically. Okay. So far, any question on the stakeholders or basically the parties who actually plan in construction? So namely, we would have in a macro manner will be the client, the consultant, and also the contractor. No? Okay, so if no, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so basically what are the definition of construction planning, or what construction planning would be? Okay, so there are several explanations to it. Okay, so construction planning basically includes prescribing how each work task is to be performed. Okay, involve the selection of construction methods, related support, management procedures. Okay, other than that, we can mention construction planning as how things will be done. Okay, so how things will be done basically it involve understanding on the technological processes involved in construction methods. Okay, and also decision as to when things will be done. So anyhow, whatever here basically should answer here. So in general, when we are talking about planning, this is the thing that you need to answer. Okay, so when we're talking about planning, it actually establishes all of this. Okay, and the next part is basically on the several levels of planning. Okay, so there are several stages of planning whereby in a construction you would have something called project planning, you would have something called pre-tender planning, you have something called pre-contract planning, and you will have something called contract planning. So the stages for each of the planning differs, and the relevant party who plans for such stages slightly differs. Okay, so the first one is basically project planning. So project planning is done by the client and also project manager that works for the client. Okay, so it is not the project manager for the contractor. It is the project manager that works for the client. So usually when we mention about project manager, whether working for client would be easier or working for contractor would be easier. In general, okay, if you are a project manager that works for the client, you only supervise, or basically you only monitor the work of the contractor, main contractor. Okay, so you do not need to come, or you do not need to design this specific planning. So you do not need to come up with the detailed design of construction, because it's the job of the project manager for main contractor to come up with that. So as a project manager for client, you are basically working for the funder, and your job is to manage to ensure that your main contractor is doing the job. Okay, so it's like macam mando lah, right? So meaning to say that all the hard work, all the detailed design or detailed planning in construction is done by main contractors, project manager. So it will be easier basically to work with the client. Okay, so project manager that works with the client will be more you do not need to go to the bits and details of it. Cuma in terms of knowledge, you will not be understanding in that depth how the planning came by. Okay, so itu je lah beza dia. So as the project manager that works for the client, it is more on the superficial level. So it's like a mandor macam tu. So for pre-contract, you are the one who are planning, who's planning for each of the planning in detail. So in terms of knowledge, this person would have a much better knowledge in how elements are constructed on site. Okay, so rather than project manager, you will know for the client superficially as such. Okay, so for project planning, okay, so it starts with the client team. Okay, so master schedule is produced at the project planning, and there are several elements that you might want to look into a project at the project planning stage. Okay, so remember that project planning is done by the client. So as a client, you will look into something which is rather general but overall from the beginning until the end. Okay, so you might want to look into the key date of a starting and completion of project. You might want to look into the key dates of all the milestones. Okay, so for example, design, tender, construction. Okay, so it will involve the overall program. It will involve design, tendering periods. Okay, so key date, commencement and completion of construction, and stage and phase handover. So in general, all the milestones from the beginning until the end. Okay. Reason for project planning. Obviously, when we have a plan, we want to establish a realistic project master schedule. Okay, why is it master schedule? Because the contractor, the consultant will base their planning to your master schedule. Okay, so if you have a wrong master schedule, you will give the wrong information to pass on to the consultant and also the contractor. So to establish a realistic project master schedule, okay, in which the appointment of consultant, contractor, and also commission of the occupation. Okay, to identify key dates at critical stages to facilitate control of the design and tendering process. So control always comes with the word monitoring. So basically, when you have a master schedule as such, you can monitor and you can control the milestones of each of the phases too. Okay, and to identify potential risks to progress and avoid possible delays to project completion, and to monitor the actual progress and take corrective action. Well, in general, any project planning, any planning basically, your planning is done so that when you lay out, it is achievable. Okay, and why do we have that? So that we can use the plan to ensure that whatever progress on site, it goes back to the planning. So it is not planning one off and then you just leave it there and you conduct another planning on site and you do something else. Dia tak macam tu. So whatever planning, it should be well justified, representing the realistic, and that should be passed on to the contractor to implement their project pula in much detailed manner. Okay, so hence any deviation on site, it could be identified from your plan. Okay, so it is not just as a plan just for one time sake and that's it, you forget about it. Okay, so it should be brought throughout your project until the end. Okay, next is basically pre-tender planning. Okay, so pre-tender planning is done by the tendering contractors. So meaning to say that the tender is open, so the contractors bid for the project. Okay, so it is defined as contractors planning consideration during the preparation of estimate. Okay, so it's conversion into a commercial bid, right? So it's produced by tendering contractors. Why do we need this? To help in tendering process, to ensure that whatever pricing you place in there is realistic enough, it makes sense. Okay, so to assist the estimator or QS of the contractor to put in the pricing, if they have QS lah. If no, sometimes engineer does this actually. Okay, so the elements that need to look out for pre-tender planning, basically, obviously, before we can put in certain pricing to it, there would be site visits. If not by yourself, it will be organized by the client. Okay, so site visit to ensure that you have your desk study, you have known, okay, based on GIS, based on those days mapping, what is there. Okay, so how far or how near is it to the nearby water resource, nearby river and utilities and so on, so that you can have an idea what are the utilities being required and how far do you need to actually extend it to your site and so on. Okay, so site visit is important because your landscape changes, particularly if you are talking about your project in urban area. Okay, so suddenly you might see 10 years ago there would not be any building, but recently there would be building as such there. Okay, so I think that's important in terms of site visit. And then you need to also decide on the current rate of material. Okay, so material prices changes, especially if we are talking about which are import export kind of material. Okay, so those actually affects quite a lot with the economy changes. Method statement, any simple method, how are you going to conduct your construction. Okay, so what are the selection of the method, because the determination of the method would actually provide you the cost. Okay, so what type of cost being implied if you select a certain method, time planning for that, and also financial resource you would have. Okay, what are the capitals in hand that you have? What are the equipments you have in hand? So those are the things. Basically, this is essential for the client to see how reliable in terms of capital you are. Okay, so if there are any capital constraint, will you be able to still go on with the project with that financial capital that you have in hand? Okay, so pre-tender planning. The reasons that we have pre-tender planning, obviously to ensure that you come up with a realistic contract document. Okay, so which the tender will be based on. You will be able to identify the methods. You'll be able to identify the method and how it affects your bid prices. Okay, and also it's in building up contract prelim, plant expenditure, especially when you're talking about hiring, renting, tower crane, and so on. So it will involve quite high cost as such. Okay, and to aid in the tendering process. Okay, so this stage is basically for tendering contractor, assisting the tendering contractor to place a bid. Okay, so far any question? All right, so just to recap, we have done on the first one, which is project planning. So project planning is done by the client's organization that looks into the planning of a project from the beginning until the end. All right, so second is a planning done by tendering contractor, is what we call pre-tender planning, for contractors to actually place in a realistic bid. Okay, and the third one is basically pre-contract planning. Okay, so pre-contract planning is a planning done by winning contractor. Okay, so a contractor after bidding, okay, so let's say 10 bidding contractors, one selected to win the contract. Okay, that one contractor would have pre-contract planning, okay, before the contract planning. Okay, so pre-contract planning is a period between contract award and commencement on site. It's a short time period. Okay, so it's a time period where, okay, today you have been given the contract, but you cannot move on to the site tomorrow. Okay, so there will be given, for example, 14 days or 2 weeks time period for your planning, so that once you go onto the site, work could commence. All right, so it will be a very short time period, but there are a lot of things for you to actually plan so that your site could commence properly. Okay, so this is a contract master program. Okay, so whereby this will ultimately be the master plan or master program for the contractor. Okay, so this is where it states main construction activities, and usually this copy of the program will be given to the client's representative or the client for them to actually monitor your progress, okay, contractor's progress during construction. So basically pre-contract planning is whereby the contractor would think through, we have got the award, we have got the contract, based on the specification, based on the contract, how long do we have and what we need to achieve. So main program by the main contractor. Okay, so once you have done that, usually we have target program. So target program is basically the compressed version of contract master program. Okay, so it's a more detailed program coming from the contract master program. So usually as a main contractor, we have one master program that we pass on to the client. Okay, so that will be not that optimistic program. We just lay out a program as such, and this is how we're going to address the program by the client. However, internally, we would have a much shorter version of each activity so that we have the buffer time. All right, so target program is whereby it much more compressed from the program that we pass on to the client, so that if anything happen, there are buffer time for us to fall back on. Okay, so that is contractor's internal program, and it will be much more detailed. All right, reasons for pre-contract planning. One is to provide outline plan, okay, strategy for the project. So construction strategy. Okay, so once you're here, you understand that there are certain terms to the contract. This is where you actually lay out your plan, and this plan will be provided to the client. Okay, so outline the plan strategy for the project, and of course, you can only do this after you understand the contract. Okay, so to comply with the contract condition. So for in a contract document, usually they will be provided contract condition. So for JKR project, Public Works Department project, usually for example JKR 203. And for private, usually they look into PAM, Persatuan Arkitek Malaysia's condition of contract. Okay, so your condition of contract would ascertain there who is the superintendent officer, for example, what are the role of superintendent officer. So we call it SO lah. Okay, and how or what factors allow you to apply or for extension of time and so on. Okay, so that is the condition of contract. So sometimes condition of contract too, we buy something and we do not really read, but that is the condition. If anything goes wrong, the condition saves you from it, or the condition would actually cause more damage to you. Okay, so syarat contract. Okay, so that is important to be read. Okay, and then why else do we need this type of contract? Okay, this type of planning basically to ensure construction sequence. Okay, so to ensure or to identify the key project dates, to highlight key important information, to enable assessment of contract budget, cumulative value forecast. So this one, cumulative value forecast, we will go through it in the scheduling stage. Okay, so after we have done the CPM and so on, we will be able to come up with cumulative. Cumulative is on the side, we call it S-curve. If you have come across, basically S-curve. Okay, so the forecast in the form of S-curve, but we'll go through it after once we have done the the calculation on duration though. Okay, and to schedule key dates with respect to key material and also subcontractor requirement. So these are some of the reasons why we need that type of planning before we commence on the site. Okay, and what are the things that we need to look at this short stage? Many things. Okay, first we need to look at the detailed work program. Okay, so you can use CPM, you can use precedence, but of course nowadays on construction site, I highly doubt anyone is doing it by manual lah. Okay, so but you need to know the fundamentals of what actually each of the elements mean. So that's why in this study we will actually conduct the manual. But if you have Microsoft project, you can always check your calculation with the software. Okay, so basically the fundamentals usually goes back to precedence diagram. Okay, and then this is where you think of the insurance. This is where you think of subcontracting, your foreman. This is where you call in for tender for any specialized job, such as you have leave, for example. So leave are something specialized, so you might want to call in tender for that. This is where you look into your materials, your suppliers, your subcontractors. Okay, so you hire staff based on site. So you would need to think of the position of your site office, how your site office will be, who will be what do you call, based at the site. Okay, you must have a site club, for example. Okay, so you're hiring site staff. How many engineers do you require? So project managers and so on. And of course, at the same time, you need also know the local authorities within that vicinity of your project. What council it falls under your project too, so that anything you need to get back to the authority. And of course you're talking about Department of Safety and Health. So which locality are you requiring to respond to? Okay, so you need to know that. Working capital. Okay, so the cost of starting up, kicking off the project, prepare equipment, and also design of temporary structures. Okay, so temporary structures, basically we will be talking about temporary roads, temporary drainage, sediment pond, workers quarters. Okay, hoarding surrounding your area, So there are a lot of temporary elements that you need to think of. The utilities, okay, electricity, water supply, and so on. Okay, so a lot of things that you need to think of before you can even step a foot into the site. Okay, all right. So far, any question on this one, pre-contract planning? So this is done by a contractor who won over the tender, won over the contract, but before starting the work, the physical work on a construction site. Any question on that? Okay, tak ada Then I think we'll try to close up with contract. Okay, contract planning is where it is done by the same contractor that won the contract, but cuma the planning is from site possession until completion. Okay, so they will have a detailed planning. Okay, so you have the master plan, tapi you have a detailed planning that is from site possession until completion. So until default liability period. So your master program that you have initiated previously in the pre-contract planning will be further developed. Okay, and your planning might be in terms of weekly or in terms of fortnightly. Okay, so you have short time period so that you can monitor those activities closely, so you know that by each day what needs to be completed. Why do you need such? So that it is easy for you to monitor, it is easy for you to take action if there are any deviation. If you leave your project at a weekly basis, it's quite difficult for you to see where the problem actually occurs from. Okay, so it's important that you have program at a very if you can do it daily, then you is much better, so that you know daily this work needs to be done, this work needs to be completed. Okay, certain completing of how many beams, the location of beam needs to be completed. So benda tu is very obvious to you. But if you're talking about weekly, you just lump, okay, foundation at that area to be completed, tapi you don't know where is the problem. So you're, let's say at the end of after 1 week, you realize there are delay, but you're not sure where. So if you can actually identify point by point, B1, B2, B3 to be completed, you can see where the problem actually arises from. Okay, so it's a short-term planning program. Can be weekly, can be fortnightly, but if you do it daily, then you can give a very clear picture. Okay, so done by main contractor. To maintain control, to ensure your project complete within the time, cost, semua tu. Okay, so contributes by submitting their work program or through approval. So usually as a main contractor, but doing the job at a daily, weekly basis, you might need input from subcontractor juga. Because main contractor, you might not be overlooking all small details. So you might not be looking at reinforcement bar, for example. So you would have subcontractor to actually look into that. Okay, and if delay or disruption happen, then changes will be recorded in a revised program, which will be updated. Okay, so it will be called as-built program, similar to as-built drawing, because as-built is as it is. Okay, you have plan, but sometimes what happens on the site differs from your plan, but you need to record what happened on the site. If there is a delay, you need to be recorded, and you need to think of a way how you can bring your project back to the same, the initial plan. Okay, all right, so elements to look into are as such. Okay, so obviously whatever on site. Okay, so start the activity as planned, monitor the progress. Okay, so prepare daily report and so on. Okay, so and the reasons we have the contract planning to monitor the master program. Okay, so to plan site operation, to optimize resources and so on. All right, so I think in the next class, I will still try to talk back on this contract planning because it's already 10. So just remind me to just recap back on contract planning so that we can go in detail in terms of this. All right, so far, any question?
No.
No, is it clear to you? No question at all?
So far okay, doctor.
All right. In that case, we'll stop our class here. But just remind me to go back on contract planning too, because we are finishing it in a rush macam ni. Okay, so we'll go back still to contract planning. But I think we have so far clarified on project planning, pre-tender planning and pre-contract planning. Cuma contract planning ni we kind of trying to complete it in a rush. So we'll go back on this in the next class. Okay. All right, so with that, I think we'll end our class today. Okay, so thank you for all of your attention. All right, so I'll see you in the next class.
Thank you, Doctor.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you,
Okay.
doctor.
All right.